All right. First order of business on the stream today. We got to do our matchup guide. We're going to be talking a little bit about Death Shadow versus Yawgmoth in honor of Demonic Tutors just winning these this past Saturday's Modern Challenge with Black Green Yawgmoth. So I wanted to talk about that matchup a little bit. So we'll be going over like some play patterns to recognize, your role in the matchup. We'll talk about sideboarding with a bunch of different shadow variations and kind of go from there. So first off is like identifying that you're up against Yawgmoth, right? Like what are some of the telltale signs to let you know this is what's happening? Um, some of the common starts are like uh God, Birds of Paradise, Ignoble Hierarch, Young Wolf can often kind of clue you in. Ignoble Hierarch could be Infect, but that's way less popular in the current meta. So typically you're going to be looking at like Young Wolf, Ignoble Hierarch, Birds of Paradise. Um, Sometimes Noble Hierarch, but way less often. Any of those can be like a pretty big indicator. And then on turn 2, like Strangleroot Geist, Wall of Roots are pretty dead giveaways. So you've identified that your opponent's on Yawgmoth. Where should your priorities be going? First and foremost, keeping Yawgmoth itself off the board if possible. So a lot of the cheap creatures you're not too afraid of, like your Mana Dorks, Dryad Arbor, Young Wolf, even Strangleroot Geist, Walvard, stuff like that, aren't very impactful. But Yawgmoth itself and Grists, the Hunger Tide, are two of the very problematic cards that deck can put out against you. So Hand Disruption to take either one of the payoffs or like a Quarter Calling Eldritch Evolution out of hand can be big. Or making sure you've got some amount of removal for the actual problem cards when they come down. But for the most part in game one, you're going to have a little bit of a tough time if you don't have like an aggressive Dragon's Rage Channeler, Ledger Shredder, Murktide out of some of those decks draws to be able to fly over a lot of these Undying creatures. But you can still win the game by tempoing out with like getting a Flying Threat on board or a big Shadow plus like a Battle Rage, keeping Yawgmoth and Grist at bay and closing out the game quickly. You really have to transition to the aggressor role as quickly as you possibly can. Otherwise, they are going to outvalue you in the late game with Yawgmoth, Grist, their ability to tutor up those cards, Blood Artist. So make sure that you're not trying to misevaluate your role and really go on the defensive. Because 1-for-1 removal is not going to work out great in your favor. Letting them accumulate an extensive amount of mana is going to be pretty rough on you. So try to turn the corner as quickly as you can. So a little bit of like sideboarding. You've recognized that you're against Yawgmoth. You're going into the sideboard games. What are you looking to bring in, bring out? What are they likely bringing in, bringing out? Let's talk about their side first. And we're just pulling up a Demonic Tutors list they just won this past Saturday's Modern Challenge with. It's a good place to start. Some of the better cards that they can bring in against us, depending on the variation of Shadow, are like Endurance, Unlicensed Hearse, Obstinate Baloth, Crime and Punishment. Any of those cards you're likely to see come in. Usually I would say Endurance, Crime and Punishment are probably like the best options. Unlicensed Hearse is okay at stopping Delirium for things like Dragon's Rage Channeler and Unholy Heat. But ultimately it doesn't usually impact the board in too meaningful of a way. But Endurance, stopping Delirium as well as providing a reasonably sized body is a lot more problematic. Crime and Punishment, they usually don't care about like wiping out a couple Mana Dorks, a Young Wolf or something if they get to wipe out all of our pressure at once. So keep that in mind. Board outs are usually going to be things like Eldritch Evolution, because it's a card that's going to make them sack one of their cards to go find something but especially into a counterspell variation of Death Shadow, it's a high risk, high reward play. So Eldritch Evolution's often coming out. If there's any like Thought Seizes or stuff in the main, those might get trimmed. And then likely some number of mana dorks if they're just wanting to bring in extra cards. From the shadow side, cards like Dress Down out of the blue variations are really, really good. So if you don't know, Undying on cards like Young Wolf, Strangleroot Geist, Rawls Messenger triggers while the creature's on the battlefield. It does not trigger from the graveyard. So if you're able to dress down before a creature dies, it won't get that Undying trigger. It loses that ability on the field. So it goes to the graveyard, stays in the graveyard. You don't have to worry about it coming back. Can also be great about like time walking things like Yawgmoth. So if you respond to a Yawgmoth with the dress down, they can't just start sacking stuff off, and you might be able to squeeze in a removal spell there, interact profitably. Can stop ETB abilities on things like Endurance, Obstinate Baloth, if you really care about bringing in Drown for Obstinate Baloth. Anything like that. Unlicensed Hearse is a great bring in, able to eat stuff when the Undying trigger happens before it's able to come back to stop like the Yawgmoth loops with the Undying creatures. Engineered Explosives is reasonable to try to take out a couple 1-drops, couple 2-drops, something like that at once. Might be able to break up combo that way, but usually post board, you're not so worried about comboing out. You're more worried about just 2-1s that keep recurring and 1-1s that keep recurring, and eventual Yawgmoth hitting the board and just drawing 4, 5, 6 cards. Turok, I've seen it be okay. Usually it's not too good, but there have been spots like on the play where it's been okay, but it's not one of the first things I'm bringing in. K Command, kind of the same thing. Like it can be okay as just a 3-mana shock to kill something that's maybe already gotten an Undying trigger, but ultimately it is going to be a little bit slow. Out of some of the other lists like Dimir, cards like Surgical Extraction aren't great, but usually necessary. Dress Down can come in. We already talked about EE. Ashiok is good at stopping things like Court of Calling, but you're not going to be able to nab any Undying creatures with an Ashiok minus. So just keep that in mind that like the card is, or Ashiok itself is like only good against Court of Calling. There's not really going to be anything else that it's overly useful for. In like the Rakdos lists, I would not recommend Blood Moon, but like Dolthy is lights out against Yawgmoth. It's like you have to grist this, or it's just owning the entire game. Turns all your removal into one shot, done. They can't combo with Yawgmoth. Like, can't block it. Best card in the matchup by a mile. Pyrite Spellbomb's great. Terminates are obviously coming in as additional ways to deal with Yawgmoth. For board outs, on the draw especially, but on the play, some number of Ragavans. Usually I say like on the draw, I might take out like 3 of them. On the play, I might take out 2, because between Mana Dorks, Strangleroot Geist, Wall of Roots, Young Wolf, Grist tokens, Ragavan's going to get stonewalled very, very quickly and very, very often. Occasionally on the play, you can get a line of like, start off with a Ragavan, they have a Mana Dork, kill it, you get an attack in, you get to play another threat. But even just like a Young Wolf can kind of slow that plan down pretty aggressively. Depending on the number of Veil of Summers you're expecting, you might want to trim on a Hand Disruption piece or 2. It's not as bad as Ragavan, but some of these can be pretty dead once you get to like the mid to late game and they've accumulated a lot of mana. if you're really feeling you're on the aggressive front foot, like if you're playing Rakdos or something where Shadow, Scourge, Battle Rage is like one of your primary game plans, then Street Wraith should stay in. Otherwise, you might want to trim one or two to try to mitigate some of the life loss against things like really quick Strangleroot guys starts. So just be a little bit careful there. Like, you do need to be conscientious of your life total, but most of the time it's not going to be a matchup where your life total is very in danger if you're getting the pressure. If you like fetch shock, fetch shock, fetch shock, cycle Street Wraith, get down a Shadow, and you aren't accounting for something like Grist, then that can get completely blown out. But if you're able to like Thought Seize a Court of Calling or an Eldritch Evolution, control the board a little bit, couple pieces of removal, lower your life total, get down a Shadow, then taking the aggressor role can have a very big payoff. Again, we are like the aggressor in the matchup, so you do have to be very proactive. I know there's plenty of times that you'll see your opponent like playing Strangleroot Geist and attacking into you, knowing your Shadow. But at the end of the day, like, it is our job to get the opponent dead. If we sit back too much, we're going to be in a world of hurt. And some of these other lists, like Mardu, Necromancia could be a board in to name Yawgmoth itself or Grist. It's a reasonable play. It's a little slow because oftentimes, like, especially on the draw, by the time we get to 3 mana, our opponent's got enough mana and cards to get Yawgmoth or Grist on the battlefield. So, not the greatest plan, but it is something that you can look potentially into boarding into if you have something that you really want to get out in the matchup. For like the Saga variations of Shadow, you can always bring in Soul Guide Lantern or a Nihil Spellbomb, something like that, to help manage the graveyard. Try to snag one of the Undying creatures. And we'll talk about some play patterns here in a second. Just making sure there's no little cards here and there that I'm missing. Esper, cards like Prismatic Ending, March of Otherworldly Light are fantastic for actually exiling stuff and not having to deal with Undying triggers. But at the same time, like any spot removal you have in the board, you're bringing in. In this case, I'm probably bringing in Batterskull as well. Just like a consistent beater that doesn't hate or doesn't let my opponent out aggro me. I think that's like the best way of putting it. So yeah, let's go to some of the common post-board play patterns. So going into game 2, you're on the play, we'll say, what kind of hands are you looking for? For the most part, I'm really looking for a hand that's got, like, especially on the play, some piece of hand disruption, so I can try to nab a payoff before they have the chance to cast it. And the information is huge to know, like, what I need to play around, what I need to play into. On the draw, hand disruption gets a little bit dicier because of Veil of Summer. Now, Veil is one that I've seen more and more lists like cutting. For instance, the list Demonic Tutors just won the challenge with is not running any copies of Veil of Summer in the 75. So that might be something that you recognize in the next few weeks if you run into Yawgmoth, is they're likely to be playing an iteration of his list. And if that's the case, Veil of Summer might be something that you just like don't want to respect at all post board. So hand disruption gets a lot better even on the draw. Removal. Bolt the Bird has been like a common phrase in Magic since Ravnica, OG Ravnica, even before, but like way back since the inception of Birds of Paradise. Essentially, it refers to the idea that, like, if your opponent's playing a ramp strategy or deck that requires mana dorks, then killing that mana dork has a couple different potential upsides. For example, they could not have additional mana sources and relying on that mana dork to get them up to whatever amount of mana they need to get to, in which case killing the mana dork could be beneficial for you for setting them back. You also have the potential of not allowing your opponent to cast any impactful spells ahead of curve. So maybe they have the mana, but they want to cast their 3-drop on turn 2, and Bolting the Bird allows you to kind of set that back pretty substantially. Bolt the Bird in this matchup is something I recommend if, big asterisk, if you have more than one piece of interaction. I would not recommend Bolting the Bird if you've got one Unholy Heat and that's it. But there are a number of times where your Yawgmoth opponent will keep a 1-lander because they are fairly land light at only 20 lands. So not seeing a 3rd land or a 4th land is fairly common for the deck. And you need to recognize those impactful mana points. So like 3 mana is an impactful point because they can hard cast Grist. Grist is a nightmare in the matchup. Want to keep it at bay at all costs. 4 mana is an impactful point because they can cast Yawgmoth. Also an impactful card. I don't think it's as impactful as Grist in this particular matchup, but still a phenomenal card that they have access to. So making sure that if your opponent's on 3 mana or has 3 mana available and you've got interaction of some sort, make sure you can fight on that Grist axis. Once they get to 4 mana, you're either fighting the board to prevent a Yawgmoth from coming down and really gaining a lot of value, or you're trying to fight the Yawgmoth on the stack with things like Drown in the Lock. Drown in the Lock, you do have to be a little bit careful with post board because of endurance, especially out of like these Grixis lists. Endurance is going to be way more impactful. So if you're really trying to set up Drown in the Lock as dealing with a problematic card, there's a high risk, high reward there where it could just be completely dead if your opponent has an endurance to evoke. But that just makes like hand disruption all the more important, so you can know about these things ahead of time instead of just like walking into them. Other than that, your Nihil Spellbomb effect. So like Nihil Spellbomb, Soul Guide Lantern, anything like that. Oh, I didn't even mention Leyline of the Void. That's also a fantastic one to bring in against Yawgmoth and can be lights out a lot of the times. Just like, again, stopping all the Undying triggers makes the deck a lot more one-dimensional. But something I see really often out of mid-range decks against Yawgmoth is, okay, I've got a Nihil Spellbomb and I've got a Lightning Bolt, and I play out my Spellbomb and I bolt your Strangleroot Geist and sack the Spellbomb and kill it. And I'm just like autopilot through that line. Feel great. I draw a card off the Spellbomb. I get rid of the Strangleroot Geist. Woe is me. Something I highly, highly recommend is sandbagging your removal. So if I've got like a Death Shadow out, my opponent's got a couple Undying creatures, I don't want to just play my removal spell, sack my Spellbomb. If my opponent's got a bunch of Undying creatures, they're more than likely to block, even if I've got a Spellbomb. Because if they give up that one creature to get rid of my Spellbomb, that's a positive on their side. But if I'm able to attack, or my opponent attacks into me, and I block, and then once that creature dies with the Undying trigger on the stack, I bolt or Unholy Heat something else and then crack my Spellbomb. Now I've gotten 2 of their Undying creatures out, and I've drawn a card off my Spellbomb. My Shadow or whatever's still around, even if I have to trade like a Ragavan or a Undelirium Channeler for something. Getting multiple creatures off the board there is going to be significantly more impactful than just like utilizing that card right away. Because if your opponent knows that you've got the Spellbomb, their first goal is going to be to get that off the board, so that if they do get to a Yawgmoth situation, they don't have to worry about that Spellbomb anymore. So you think, oh, well, I've got a spell bomb. My opponent's not going to block me. That's not the case a lot of times. A lot of times they are going to block with a less impactful creature, like an Undying creature, a Young Wolf or something, to try to get you to pop that spell bomb aggressively. So if you can use that to your advantage by getting the block, killing something else, then sacking, uh, then you're going to have a much better time at like keeping the board at bay. That goes especially well for situations where you're worried about a grist. So if my opponent's got like a Young Wolf and a Strangleroot Geist, and I attack him with my Shadow, and I'm worried the next turn they're going to play a third land and grist and sack one of their Undying creatures and kill my Shadow, then if I can get like a double kill here, draw a card, and then next turn they have a grist on an empty board, I might be able to manage that a lot better. Now I'm like attacking into the grist and they've got to block with the insect, or maybe I find a removal spell for the insect and I get to kill the grist. Something like that is a lot more uh, plausible for navigation than trying to like bolt and Nihil Spellbomb a what's it called? Strangleroot Geist, and then attacking into just a Young Wolf, and my opponent knowing like, okay, I can freely block, or I can just choose to let that hit me because next turn I'm gonna have a grist and I'm gonna be able to sack it or sack the Young Wolf, kill the Shadow. So just keep those situations in mind. Like if you have the option to get a 2-for-1, try your absolute best to get a 2-for-1, because with all these Undying creatures being so good against spot removal and our deck being so spot removal focused, that's something that you're gonna want to try your best to stay ahead of. Post board cards like Teamer Battle Rage are absolute all stars. Like being able to trample over a bunch of cheap blockers with Shadow, Scourge, whatever else you've got. Murktide Regent is huge. If you're running a Ledger Shredder build, Dragon's Rage Channeler build, those are fantastic. Dragon's Rage Channeler a little bit less because of endurance, but like Ledger Shredder, Murktide are going to be really solid. I would consider like trimming a Murktide because of endurance. You just don't want to put yourself in a situation where you've got like 2 Murktides in hand, your opponent evokes an endurance, and all of a sudden I've got 2 dead cards because of their one there. So keep that in mind. Other than that, unless anybody in chat has got any sort of questions about the matchup, that should be pretty much everything. I'd say like if you're in an area, some local meta where there's just Yawgmoth all over the place, which here we have a lot of Yawgmoth players like Tom Ross and Aaron Barrett that kind of like founded the deck, both live in my area, not directly here, but within a couple hours. So we got a lot of people around here that like Yawgmoth as a deck. If you're playing in an area like that, my biggest recommendation would be, if you're not playing a Giganta build and aren't like emotionally attached to Giganta, Dauthi Voidwalker is, again, probably the best card you can have in that matchup, like hands down. There's plenty of other decent options, but I think that's been the one that's been the most impactful for me. So yeah, let's go ahead and wrap it up there. So that'll be up on YouTube